Okay. Guys, welcome to Genesis. Thank you very much for joining. And tonight, again, we are proud and happy to have Mr. William Gairdner, who is a champion of freedom and champion of a lot of interesting books, especially The War Against the Family and many other important essays that he's publishing in the Epoch Times. And I'm going to put all the links in the group as usual. And William, how are you?
I'm well, thanks. Happy to be with you again. Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure.
Don't forget, we have a deal. The moment you tire of me, just fire me.
Not gonna happen. Not gonna happen. Okay, so the floor is yours, please.
So I wanted to talk today about a topic which I describe as human social bonding. And although perhaps the substance of what I'm going to say seems fairly straightforward and obvious, what's not obvious to most people who actually take the trouble to think about it is that all human social bonding, and I'm going to describe what that process is in a few moments, is naturally and necessarily anti-liberal. Now, this is a kind of inflammatory thing to say. Human social bonding is naturally anti-liberal. What do you mean by that? So now I want to explain what I mean and then circle back to that statement. The simplest way to imagine and I'm taking this from my own text and I'm interpolating as we go, adding commentary, because I can't really say it any better than I wrote it. So the simplest way to imagine the process of, let's call it the moral withdrawal from human civil societies, which is what I think has been going on, is to say that before the expanded influence of John Stuart Mill's so-called harm principle, which, as already mentioned in a couple of other of these lectures, he floated so influentially in his otherwise confused little booklet called On Liberty, which he published in 1859. If you read excellent historians like Gertrude Himmelfarb, she will expressly say in her many books that John Stuart Mill's book, a little book, it's only like 100 pages, On Liberty it's called, and I recommend people read it if they haven't, especially section 1, which is the only part anybody ever reads. In the other 3 or 4 sections, he tends to go back on many of his own initial arguments. In fact, it's almost funny the way he does that. And for a guy who was known for his acute logical methodology, it was amusing to hear Karl Marx say, with respect to John Stuart Mill, that his thoughts were like boomerangs. They always came back to hit him. And I think this is one that certainly hit him, the idea of the harm principle. Boiled down to the essence of it, what that basically says is that you're free to do anything you want as long as you don't harm another or someone else. Now that's Gertrude Himmelfarb in her books on history will tell us that this has become the main, almost the only significant moral principle left in modern democratic societies. Sure, individuals have other ones. Sure, they think that other things are morally important. But in terms of how society operates, the main theme seems to be the harm principle. Now, what is the harm principle? What is the idea that you should be able to do anything you want as long as you don't harm someone else? Well, first of all, it's a kind of modification of the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Except it's not as generous as that. It doesn't care what you actually do unto others. What it wants you not to do is to harm you, and it forbids you to harm others. Now, the basic difficulty with this principle is that it has nothing to say about the good. Like the harm principle, don't harm other people. Otherwise, whatever you want to do is fine. It says nothing about the human good, nothing about the social good, nothing about the future, and nothing about unintentional harm, and nothing about future harm. So it's a very present. I just lost my camera here. Here we go. It's a very present-oriented, choice-based dictum, which has been replacing traditional moral standards in Western societies. And I'll explain in a moment exactly how that happened in Canada, where courts have stood on Mill's harm principle themselves, and in a sense dictated to the public by way of their judgments, rooted in Mill's harm principle. Anyway, the whole thing was a tidy and simplistic little soundbite formula of a public attitude that was in the air already. It wasn't like Mill invented all this out of whole cloth. It was in the air, and he formulated it in a way that people remembered. And what happened? Well, members of all human civil societies in the West, at least, had always imagined themselves, and I mentioned this metaphor before, it's important to mention it again, they had imagined themselves to exist within a kind of common moral bubble. Just imagine a huge kind of invisible tennis court bubble. We've all seen those inflated structures that people put over tennis courts in bad weather or whatever. Well, a moral bubble can be imagined as something stretching like that, but it's invisible. But it's over the whole nation and over an entire community. And the purpose of that moral bubble is to hold the common moral life of all the people together. Within this bubble, as adults, people used to debate. They supported and reinforced or critiqued the community standards of their common life as a community. But once the self-serving harm principle took hold, individuals began to imagine themselves to exist within only a personal moral bubble. And so morality was now slowly shifting and becoming a matter of personal invention, of preference, and of choice. And we all know that word is just everywhere today in the public square. Anytime you see a demonstration, at least in my country, you'll see all kinds of placards held up, my choice, such as an abortion, which we'll get to shortly. My body, my choice, as if choosing something could make it right. It's the dumbest damn thing I ever heard, because obviously people can choose terrible things and often do. So, to rely on the mechanics of individual choosing as a kind of imprimatur of moral goodness is just a huge mistake. At any rate, as I say, morality was now a matter of personal invention, preference, and choice, and any direct harm done by the collision with another individual who believed the same thing could simply be dismissed as negligible, if it was negligible, or negotiated away between the two parties. Thus, today, very little thought is now given to, as I say, to indirect harm, as when we all feel that something terrible done has offended our community moral standards, or shames and demeans the entire community, or even the whole nation. We hardly hear talk of that anymore, whereas it used to be quite common. You're demeaning the office of the president. You're demeaning the office of the professoriate, or, whatever it is, or of the clergy, or of a political office. The idea that an office in itself has respect regardless of who's in it is very ancient in the thinking of the West. Slowly disappearing. Now it comes down to who's in it and what they're doing. Actually, I guess you'd say this moral individualism and relativism trend has gone so far in places like Canada, my country, that in a case called the Queen, we use the letter R for Regina or Regina in Latin, the Queen versus Labbé in 2005, Canada's Supreme Court actually directly cited Mill's harm principle in announcing that this would henceforth replace community standards of morality in Canada. Now that was Quebec Supreme Court, not the Canadian Supreme Court, but how precedent operates. This has become a kind of new standard of a new moral standard in our communities. The first time I actually saw Mill quoted in a legal document. And never before, I would say, in the entire long history of the Western world, has any court gone so far as to dismember the immemorial common moral bonds of its own civil society in the name of mere individual freedom. We'll get back to why I say it's mere individual freedom. If we want a clue as to why we are breaking the bonds, the human bonds of our societies, we need look no further. Just look to the judges, most of whom are very leftist, libertarian, and so on in their political notions, as unsophisticated as they may be. That's what it boils down to. Now, it is impossible to understand the conservative impulse without insight into the fine details of exactly how human social bonding works. As I explain here, this is a psychological and social process common to all human beings and is profoundly conservative in its very nature. I agree with the libertarian that human beings must be free moral agents in order to be human, but I agree with the traditional conservative that they mostly desire to be free so they can bind themselves with other human beings to the common good. Now, in the free act of self-binding, they create their distinctive human associations, the sum of which constitute civil society. Now, let's see how this works. And I'm going to say I'm not actually boasting, I hope, but I can remember clearly the day the idea of let's call it the social and psychodynamics of this process sprang into my mind. Other people may have come across it before or invented it before or tried to describe it before, but I've never seen it exactly in these words and terms. And I think it's one of the most important realities of modern life is how human social bonding is inherently anti-liberal and how that necessarily comes into conflict with the liberalism, which is primarily forced egalitarianism of the modern state. So what you see here is a clash between the state at the top and civil society in the middle, with individuals at the bottom also dismantling civil society in the name of individual choice. How is civil society ever going to survive this mutual pressure, one from the top, which is the egalitarian state, and the other from the bottom, which is the choosing individual, who is attacking civil society and common moral standards all the time. In the name of what? In the name of individual choice and individual liberty. So whereas we all may have started our own political thinking as proud defenders of the idea of individual liberty, once we begin to see it as an inimical force that can take apart entire civil societies over time, we get a different view of whether it's good or it's bad. And it really boils down to, it depends what it's being used for. So all modern democratic states, I continue here, operate within a three-level political structure in which power from the top and pressure from freedom and rights-seeking autonomous individuals at the bottom act in tandem as a corrosive pincers to strangle the integrity, the authority, and the freedom of civil society itself. Now, Edmund Burke talked in many of his documents about what he called social freedom. Of course, he understood the idea of individual freedom, but he was wary of it. And why was he wary? I'll tell you why. He said, because liberty, I'm quoting him, liberty, he said, when men act in groups, is power. And if people are getting together, describing what they're doing as liberty and taking aim at you, watch out. So again, I quote him, liberty, when men act in groups, is power. And so you better be asking yourself, what are they using the concept of liberty to do or to get or to destroy? In this sense, you can see that liberty itself, the idea of human freedom, is really a tool. It's a political tool, masquerading as a moral tool, which can be used for almost anything and has been throughout Western history, in the French Revolution and in the various political disturbances in my country, in America, in European countries. People who are causing tremendous trouble throughout history usually resort to the idea of freedom, that they're doing it in the name of freedom. That's certainly what the French did in the French Revolution. And it is ridiculous to do as many of the Marxist historians in France did for years, which is to try to argue that the terror which developed in the French Revolution, the massacre and the guillotining of hundreds of thousands of their own law-abiding citizens, was what they called their words, a break from the actual revolutionary doctrine. Well, that's completely false. And modern historians have shown it to be false and have described the terror of the French Revolution as a direct result of the liberties announced in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen of, well, I think it was 1789. Glorious sounding document about human rights and liberties, which was used to kill people, basically. And if you want to see a very proud and stirring constitution, just look at the original Soviet constitution, which became the cornerstone of the USSR. All those gulags and prison camps and slaughters of millions upon millions of their own citizens were justified by their constitutional liberties. If you read it, you won't see anything in it about the gulag or about how liberty easily gets used to kill people. I don't mean to exaggerate here. I'm not. I'm saying that if you know anything about history, this is what you will find, and it will make you very wary of such documents. And I should tell your listeners that there's a wonderful essay written by Jeremy Bentham, I think in 1842, called Anarchical Fallacies. It's difficult to read because it's written in his kind of 18th century prose. Maybe it's possible to find more up-to-date, simpler language. But if you take your time and study it, Bentham tears a strip off the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Just tears a strip off. He makes a logical hash of every one of those statements in such a convincing way that you wonder how an entire nation why they actually decided to rest their new country on such self-conflicting and corrosive ideals as liberty, equality, and fraternity. One great British critic, other than Bentham, said, well, the problem with liberty, equality, and fraternity is that the first two terms will make the third term impossible, because liberty and forced equality, at least, of the kind that the French were talking about and that we're talking about today, are opposites. It's like what we call a teeter-totter, or what do you call it, where the kids get on each end of a plank and they go up and down. So liberty and forced equality are like a teeter-totter. When one goes up, the other has to go down. You can't have both at the same time. You can have what they call formal equality along with liberty, which is how a lot of Western democracies began. They weren't trying to force equality. They weren't trying to force outcomes. They were simply saying that all human beings are equal in the eyes of God and before the law. The prince should be punished the same way as the pauper for stealing a loaf of bread. But other than that, we're not going to make the pauper and the prince equal through forced social policy, you see, because when you try to do that, you have to take from Paul to give to Bill, or take from Bill to give to Paul. You know, these are opposite assumptions and notions. I've departed a bit from my main theme here, which is why human social bonding is anti-liberal, but it's all part of it. So this process of forcing egalitarianism from the top, combined with a radical individualist autonomism at the bottom, is of great concern to any true conservative, for it explains why the formerly free and thriving civil societies, excuse me, of all modern democracies that have always supplied so much satisfying human social bonding are being slowly gutted. Well, now I'm going to say not so slowly. What follows is an explanation of the four-part microdynamics, I'm calling it, of all human social bonding, showing how and why it is a fundamentally and necessarily anti-liberal or non-egalitarian process that can only succeed because it is anti-liberal. For without intense social bonding, no civil society worth the name can ever be created or nor survive. I am quite certain that the officially egalitarian political philosophy now thriving in all modern democratic states, we might as well call it egalitarian statism, combined with a moral philosophy of radical individualism, which is what we have, is destroying Western civilization entirely by gutting its civil societies, those human realities which exist in the middle between the autonomous individuals at the bottom, of whom there may be millions upon millions, and the egalitarian state at the top. For all governments are, here we go, all governments happen to be parasitical on their own civil societies. They tax their societies. Thereby, they feed on them, and they cannot survive without them. And if this is true, why would they be in the business of killing them, of making them less powerful and less strong? I'm going to explain why. Worst of all, they have a monopoly on power, and they may, once out of control, entirely exhaust their hosts, morally and financially. And this is when you get extreme and rapid decline of any civilization, including the Roman civilization. This is what I'm describing is what happened there, and it's happening here in my country and maybe in yours too. So what is of primary importance, even to the very endurance of the state itself, and this is a core conservative tenet, is the life and vibrancy of civil society. The basic reason that the four elements of social bonding I'm about to describe are profoundly anti-egalitarian is because they culminate in privilege and in protection for members only. Privilege is a dirty word, as you know. Everybody's against privilege these days. This is the social justice flag. Masthead is anti-privilege. But here are some examples of how this works. My family confers family rights and obligations only on me and on our family. My company confers rights and privileges and duties only on its employees. My cycling club on its members only, and so on. There is a good argument, and I am repeating the argument here, that what all modern states attempt to do is to hijack for themselves the deep, interdirected human desire for social bonding that they realize is so strongly expressed in civil society. And listen up, they seek to do this with what I call substitute caring. Let me give you an example of how substitute caring works. We all know how it works. If you love a woman who is loved by another man, you try to offer a better love in hopes of transferring, geez, I lost my thing here. Oh, anyway, it doesn't matter, I guess. Here we are. Video. Lost the video, sorry.
No, you're back. I can see you. But I cannot hear you, William. You have to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, sorry. I think I got excited and I hit a keyboard by mistake. Anyway, they try to do this with substitute caring. If you love a woman who is loved by another man, you try to offer a better love. Why? Because you hope to transfer her love to yourself. Just so, all states see the powerful love and allegiance created by human social bonding at work in their own civil societies. And so, without weakening their own civil societies irreparably, because they do inevitably, but not irreparably, that's important that they keep that balance. That is, while still preserving the intensive labors of civil society, which are provided by its members, the members of civil society, that is, not by government. Your family members provide all the labors for your family. The government doesn't, unless you've got some problem that makes you a dependent on the government. Without which the state could not function at all, they attempt to maintain the functions, but transfer the emotional allegiance to the state through the offer of a better love, or affection, if you like. This love is offered in the form of an equality of benefits and services for all, via tax privileges, grants, state services, and so on. And those are substituted for those customarily rendered by civil society to itself. And the deepest hope of the invading state is to convert the state itself into a single national family. Our own Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, he was a Prime Minister a couple of decades ago, a conservative Prime Minister. I'll never forget, I was writing my book, The War Against the Family, at the time, and this man was running around the country making various speeches describing Canada as a family. In other words, the whole country was a family in his mind. And in one of my earlier lectures for this group, I described for you how the United Nations had its International Year of the Family, in which it described the family as the, quote, the smallest democracy at the heart of society, unquote. What a confusing mess that was, and how untrue it was. And yet they marched all over the world. Rather, they flew all over the world in very expensive jet planes, preaching that the family was the smallest democracy at the heart of society, until people like me exposed the falseness of their thinking. And I think they finally just gave it up and they slunk away with their tails between their legs. But now let me explain the microdynamics of what I call human social bonding. Again, I haven't seen this anywhere else. I'm sure it exists. I'm not an original thinker from that point of view, but I haven't seen it anywhere else, so I'm happy to share it with you. And here we go. Whether we are speaking of the Boy Scouts, of a marriage, of membership in a bridge club or a social fraternity, we will usually find some expression, formal or informal, actual or symbolic, or both, of a four-stage process that includes what I call sacrifice, subordination, commitment, and privilege, in that order. Let's start with the first. Sacrifice refers to the requirement of all human social groups that individuals aspiring to join them must voluntarily agree to place the common will of the group above their own personal will. From this flows loyalty to the group. Now, the motto of common organizations like Rotary International, maybe that exists in Israel too, I don't know, but it's an international organization. And their motto is, I'm quoting, service above self, unquote. That's their motto. They fell right into my hands when I looked around with this first important aspect of social bonding, which is sacrifice. Individual members who can't make the sacrifice of self required, whether required by Rotary International or your club or your cycling group or your family, will usually leave or be shunned or be shamed or be forced out of the group. They will no longer be a real bona fide member. The second aspect of this four-step process I call subordination. And this refers to the requirement that all members submit to the authority and the rules of the group, however derived, formal or informal, as an expression of group discipline. Insubordination normally triggers some internal process for shunning, dismissing, disowning, or firing, and all members carry around within their own hearts and minds an internal understanding of the rules by which they feel bound and are proudly distinguished from non-members. Sometimes they carry membership cards, which they can show to some people. See, I'm a member of this group. Footnote is, you're not. Maybe you should join. We'd like to have you as a member and so on, but until you join, you're not getting what this group has to offer. So the important and crucially anti-liberal and anti-egalitarian process of social exclusion of non-members who are not bound by nor expected to obey those rules begins here. So then now we're on to the third part of this socio-dynamic, which I'm describing, which is commitment. Commitment is the process whereby the first two requirements having been met, a new member is asked formally what? They're asked to take a vow or make a public commitment to the group. Boy Scouts, marriage partners, and club members of all kinds make their commitments in words, in written contracts, or deeds to the ideals, activities, and undertakings that they agree to shoulder and share. No vow will mean no membership or the end of membership if you refuse. It's interesting. Mark Twain was one of my favorite writers when I was a young man. And I think it's in his book about, oh my goodness, his Huckleberry Finn, and Huck's friend is Tom Sawyer. And there's one point in the story where Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn, they decide they want to be brothers. In other words, they want to commit to a single reality, an objective. So they take a little end of a knife and they prick each other's thumb to get a drop of blood. And they put their thumbs together because they want to join their blood in a vow of love and friendship that they will never break, and so on. Anyway, Mark Twain was a very funny author, and his books are still great where they're not being banned and cleansed out of modern libraries. At any rate, the last stage we're getting at now, and this is privilege. This is the last stage of the process I've been describing, and it's the red flag for egalitarian states, whereby the group approves and bestows privileges, benefits, and protections, small or large, secret or open, whatever, on each committed member only. Now, this is often accompanied by a significant ceremony in which the commitment or vow of loyalty is made. This can be something very, very fancy, like when you join a fraternity or a sorority at a university. They have an initiation process where they drag you through some process of initiation and make you suffer. And then they take the blindfold off and ask you to make a vow to the fraternity brothers and all that kind of thing. And eventually you are accepted as a member. But they don't do that for anybody else, just to people who go through this privileging process and getting the benefits and protections, small or large, secret or open, on each committed member only. This is often accompanied by a significant ceremony, which I've just mentioned, in which the commitment or vow of loyalty is made, and by special symbols, hats, ties, rings, or costumes, or, headpieces, or whatever, intended to distinguish members from non-members. That's very anti-liberal. It's not inclusive at all. But it is a rite of passage. Boy Scouts and Shriners and these kinds of people, they get to wear their caps and their kerchiefs. and they get to say secret things. Marital partners sign covenants. They wear rings and pins, and they get lawful and exclusive access to each other, and they become eligible for certain legal, tax, and social privileges at one time available only to married heterosexual couples. Signed up club members are expected to be loyal, carry cards, be dutiful, observe their vows, pay their dues, do required club work, and abide by the rules of the group, and so on. You can see what I'm getting at here. Is that all human social bonding is intentionally and intensely anti-liberal and intentionally exclusionist, or it cannot bond. You can't bond human beings unless you take them through this four-step process that makes it possible, which means you're going to have an insider-outsider psychology, which is one of the main political realities of all of history. You know, the insider-outsider notion. It is characterized by an eagerness to distinguish, that is, to discriminate in a very positive sense between members and non-members, between those who qualify for group status and privileges, swear their allegiance to the group and its causes, and those who don't. A vibrant civil society, you might say, and I do, is a vast organism for the conferral of positive benefits, protections, and status on those who voluntarily opt in to its preferred social forms. It has no wish to harm those who refuse to opt in. Their freedoms and rights as autonomous individuals remain intact. But by this four-step process, a flourishing civil society seeks to encourage, even to lure, the undifferentiated mass of autonomous individuals into its own far more difficult and challenging forms of social life, the crowning mark of which is privilege. You can see why I said it's a red flag. And you can see why the so-called social justice movement, which is everywhere today and profoundly rooted in a kind of phony egalitarian ideology, is utterly opposed to the idea of privilege. And therefore, I say it's utterly opposed to the natural and free formation of human civil societies and human social bonding. For modern statists, however, privilege is a dreaded word, simply because the modern managerial entitlement state is defined by its eagerness to avoid privileging anyone or any social bonding process, seeking, on the contrary, to equalize outcomes and status for everyone under a common central control. Just so, the most radical project of the modern state is to circumvent this human four-step process of social bonding, either by eliminating various forms of privilege and protection by law, or, and this is the preferred method, by dumbing down or diluting or attacking legally any qualification for membership that excludes other people, which, as I say, is what makes it membership, that it excludes non-members. But once this legal attack on privilege and social bonding becomes successful, the state then proceeds to providing tax-funded benefits and legal and economic protections to all alike, without distinction, thereby converting what began as a privilege into a general government handout. Traditional marriage, for example, was, until the state substitution process became so aggressive, was always an exclusive union of one man and one woman. Its only purpose was to ensure a safe harbor for children and the continuing survival of civilization. And this, by the way, is the most powerful argument for the state defending traditional marriage, which it's now given up. Indeed, the libertarian view that the state has no business interfering in marriage seems very uplifting, except for one knockdown motive, which is to regulate and protect this institution, which is to say, the survival of civilization itself through procreation. Nevertheless, under considerable pressure to eliminate the positive discrimination that has always accompanied marital privilege, the modern egalitarian democracies, in a classic example of what I've called substitute caring, have decided to bestow all marital benefits on, quote, I'm quoting, any two persons, unquote, who want the privileges and considerable legal and economic benefits traditionally attached to procreative heterosexual marriage only. We can overhear the state musing to itself, let me see now, in order to eliminate the unacceptable, terrible charge of inequality. Sorry, were you saying something?
No.
Apologies. In order to eliminate the unacceptable, to the state that is, the unacceptable, terrible charge of inequality, we do not need to eliminate all the privileges that attach to marriage, traditional marriage. Why would we do that when married couples do so much of the valuable social work for us, especially producing all those future citizens? Instead, we can simply eliminate the traditional qualification for marriage, which is the requirement for opposite genders, and thus turn a formerly exclusive privilege and benefit into a general welfare handout for any form of cohabitation. That way, we can remove the charge of discrimination, and the caring state will look so open and so generous at the same time. In other words, the simple conversion of exclusive privilege into egalitarian right is all that is required. And that's what's happened in my country, and I'm sure yours too. This example plainly reveals that the modern state and civil society have opposing objectives from the start, that there's a mortal conflict between the deepest social dynamic that spontaneously generates a vibrant human society and the aims of the power-hungry state. Simply put, in order to spread equality by eliminating privilege, the state must actively weaken the multifarious forms of natural social bonding I have been describing and graft those loyalties onto itself by supplying attractive tax and legal benefits to everyone as substitutes for those things once supplied by civil society only to those who qualified. Citizens who could never before marry because they were of the same gender despised this intentional exclusionary privileging of man and wife. So once the state moved to change the core qualification for marriage, the only thing that justified state involvement in marriage in the first place, by the way, from opposite sex to any two persons, the latter, heated with anger at the moral code of their own civil society, could now be counted on to feel a deep gratitude to the state. In this way, listen carefully, in this way, the state steals its voting customers from its own living society in a process that in time and inevitably will always produce a dead society and an all-controlling state. Thus do powerful egalitarian states consume their own civil societies. And that's all I have to say on this topic. I think it's enough.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that I'm not participating more, but unfortunately I'm outside my home and my battery is quite low. So I'm just making sure, to be able to support the recording.
Yes.
Would you like to speak a little about abortion, please?
Oh boy, another huge topic, as you know. Mm-hmm. I feel a little bit alone in this topic too, because as far as I can tell, I'm the only one, at least in Canada, maybe there's other countries where this is happening, who has tried vigorously to make the point that all the modern democracies that have been engaging in abortion on demand, abortion as a matter of the choice of the mother, are in fact engaging in a new form of slavery. Now, that's a statement most liberals that I know, and I do have some liberal friends, they immediately get their backs up. What are you talking about? And that kind of stuff. And one of them is a very dear friend. He's a black man. And I say to him, listen, I said, you hate regular chattel slavery, right? I mean, your nation, well, never mind the fact that your nation was a participant, and the black nations of Africa created far more slaves than white people ever created, as far as I can tell. At least if you read people like Thomas Sowell, he's got a wonderful chapter in one of his books. It's called The Real History of Slavery. And his point is that the black nations of Africa were among the first in the modern world, at least, well, not so modern world, in the ancient world too, to get involved in mass slavery, selling black people, their own black people and those of their enemies, mostly to Arabs and Turks and Indians from India for hundreds and hundreds of years. So when I see arguments today, I'm digressing now, but when I see arguments today where black people in my society are calling for reparations for white slaving of black people, I would say, okay, if you want to make that argument, what about black reparations paid from black people to their own citizens that they made into slaves and sold to white people for hundreds of years? What about that? Because I'm not denying white people bought them by the millions, I'm sure, but they didn't make them slaves. They were made slaves by black people in Africa who brought them to the coast and sold them to the Portuguese, the Americans, the Spanish, whatever. I mean, the whole thing is just a terrible history, but, everybody was doing it. There was no nation on earth that wasn't involved in slavery at some point.
William, can you just remind us all who are the only people who actually stopped it? Because I'm sure it's not black and not brown or anything like that. Maybe you remember?
British Christians.
Exactly. The abolition movement,
Yeah, Wilberforce. Wilberforce was a member of the British Parliament, and he fought for 20 years to abolish slavery. And England was the first one to do it. And it actually didn't begin with the abolition of slavery. It began with the a law. This is what happened in my country. I don't think Canada's ever passed a law abolishing slavery. What it did was it passed a law abolishing what it called the future importation of slaves to Canada. And it also said that at the age of 25, anyone who was now a slave would automatically be free in Canada when they reached age 25. But nobody could import more slaves to the country. Now, the reason they did that was because Canada, like many other countries, had lured all kinds of settlers to this country, hundreds of thousands of settlers back in the day, on the promise of free land. You come to Canada and you settle here, we'll give you 1,000 acres each, free, if you come here. And of course, they couldn't work 1,000 acres by themselves, so they brought their slaves to Canada, black slaves. And the black slaves worked the farms with them. So then when the question came up whether we should be abolishing slavery or not in Canada, the argument against abolishing it was, look, you promised us free land. You didn't say we couldn't bring our slaves to work it. And now you're going to deprive us of that ability to work the land. You're going to make us poor again. We're going to have to go back to America or whatever, or fall on the state for help, because we won't be able to make the farm work without this extra labor. So the government realized that. So what they said was, we'll do it on a time basis. No more importation. You can keep the slaves you have, but any of your children, when they reach the age 25, will be free, and you can't import any more slaves. So that was kind of a way of saying, it's a bad thing, we don't like it, but we're not going to ruin you to get rid of it, at least not quickly. Anyway, the argument I've been making, and again, I haven't seen this taken up anywhere else, but I make it quite passionately when I have the opportunity, is that the abortion right is actually a form of slavery, and all the modern democracies have been engaging in a new kind of slavery. And so my black friend, whom I thought would agree with me and would hate abortion because of my argument. He actually thinks abortion is a woman's right because she's choosing it and all that kind of stuff. And I didn't want to ruin the friendship. So I didn't really try to undermine him too aggressively. But what I did say was, I do think it's a form of slavery, and here's why. No one can be made a slave unless their humanity is denied. In other words, they are declared first to be a non-human being. And once they become a non-human being, you can hire them, you can work them, you can beat them, you can do whatever you want. In some countries, terrible thing to say, you could probably kill them more or less with impunity. But you could certainly be rough on them because you could argue they're not human beings. They're something less than a human being. And it surely will shock anybody who thinks about this. In Canada's criminal code, I think it's section 225. I'm picking a number here, but I'm pretty close. The criminal law on abortion basically says that an unborn child in Canada is not a human being until it passes from the body of its mother completely and alive and intact. When that happens, it suddenly becomes a human being. So the argument I make with my friends is, obviously, before that moment, you would consider it not a human being, therefore non-human. Well, whenever you get a human being and you convert him into a non-human, you're making him into a slave. So all the modern democracies that support abortion have been supporting slavery of a new kind. And just because it's invisible, because they can't see the slave who's inside the mother, they have trouble buying the argument. But I insist on the logic of the argument. And I'll get to some of that logic in a moment. But I want to explain that in Canada, for example, we have civil law and criminal law, just like other countries do. And it's absolutely outrageous. I mean, I remember a doctor saying to me, he said, look, I'm in the operating theater in my hospital, and there's a wall 2 inches thick between me and the next operating theater. And in my theater, he said, we're trying to save the life of a premature 4-pound child who would have died if we hadn't taken it out of the womb and put it in the incubator and done all the things that we do. And we're probably spending $1 million trying to help this kid live. He said, right across that 2-inch wall, they're aborting. They're basically killing a 4-pound child. Child of the same weight, looks the same, perfectly healthy, nothing wrong with it. In fact, under modern political regimes, you can't abort the child if there's something wrong with it, because that's discrimination against the people with disabilities. And you can't abort it intentionally if it's a girl child, which is what's happening in a lot of the Western countries, by the way, and never mind India, where it's been happening for generations. You can't abort it for sex selection reasons. That's no good, and so on. That's the argument, phony logical argument. But you can abort it if you don't know what the sex is, just because it's an unborn child and has not left its mother's body yet. Now, where we begin to see the bizarreness of this in the law is that if the child has an illness and the surgeon thinks he can repair the illness, and the mother wants to keep the child, because whether or not the child lives is simply up to the mother in my country, not the father. The father has no rights. He has no say, even though it's 50% his child genetically, obviously. He has no say in whether the child lives or dies. I find that alone outrageous, speaking as a father of 5 and 16 grandchildren. I find it outrageous for anybody to tell me that that child is not just as much mine as the mother's. At any rate, suppose she wants to keep the child is ill and it needs surgery. The doctor can make an incision on the belly of the mother. He can take the baby out of the womb, puts a nice little blanket on top of her belly. He puts the baby on top of the mat or whatever, and he does the surgery. But when that child is outside the mother on the mat, and he's doing surgery on her or him, that child is legally a human being in Canada. It's now a human being. But when he finishes the surgery and puts it back in the womb again, it disappears. And legally, it becomes a non-human being again. Now, I mean, you have to be someone like Jonathan Swift, that great satirist, to really put a point to the stupidity of a country like ours, in which a child can be both human and non-human, separated only by a quarter inch of its mother's skin to make the difference. So I do have liberal friends, as I say, and they often are very strongly in support of a woman's right to choose. First, I start by saying, and I recommend this sequence, I start by saying, tell me why choice makes something good. Huh? What do you mean? I said, well, tell me why choosing something makes it good. Because people choose evil things all the time. Well, right away, they're defeated on the choice card. They can't argue choice anymore because even an idiot would have to agree that human beings often choose evil things. So choice is no defense. So then I say, listen, you just said you support a woman's right to abortion, right? Yes, I did. I say, well, you see that woman over there? And they say, yes. I say, would you agree she's pregnant? Yeah, he says, she looks pretty pregnant to me. And I say, and I say, do you think what she's pregnant with is alive? Like it's alive, or is it dead? No, obviously it's alive. He says she's carrying what? I said, what is she carrying? A snake? An albatross? A pelican? A rabbit? Is what she's carrying alive? You agree? Yes. Is it a human life? Or is it not a human life? The guy has to say, yeah, it's a human life. And then I ask them to be honest. And I say, are you in favor of killing human life at any stage from conception forward? Yes or no? And they won't answer. They quit the argument. They go cycling or something. But they have trouble answering, because what I'm basically asking them is, are you prepared to say that you are prepared to kill a human life in the womb? And at least it gets them thinking, and sometimes they come around, maybe a year or so later. You know, I've been thinking about that discussion we had, and I'm on side now. I think this is terrible, and I agree that it's a form of slavery in which all the Western democracies have been engaging. In Canada, we kill about 100,000 unborn children every year. Now, they are perfectly healthy babies. Nothing is wrong with them as far as we know. And that's part of the qualification for killing them. As I say, if there's something wrong with them, oh, you're discriminating. It's against disabled people, or discriminating on the basis of sex. If you happen to find out from your ultrasound technician that it's a girl, can't do it, or very frowned upon, you know, that kind of thing. And this is so loosey-goosey, it's hard to believe. When you go to a restaurant in Canada, you'll see on the back of the wine bottle a warning about drinking alcohol, that pregnant women should not be drinking alcohol, you know, because the baby may suffer illness or disease or whatever. Well, the pregnant woman who reads this, who's thinking of an abortion, she reads this thing and she goes, isn't that nice of them to put a warning about alcohol and the fetal alcohol syndrome, they call it, and things like that. But this very same woman can go down the street to the local hospital and get the taxpayers to pay for her to kill the child that she's carrying. So our own government will say, don't drink alcohol. The child could get fetal alcohol syndrome, but the same government will pay you to kill the baby. Now, I think on one of our previous sessions, I talked about partial birth abortion, and I'm going to talk about it again because something that bears describing like this bears repeating. Partial birth abortion was invented, I don't know where, whether in the West or China or where, but I think it's been practiced in a lot of countries. I can't find out how much it's been practiced in Canada because no one publishes these statistics. Why? Because they're embarrassed about them. It's considered an extreme form of abortion. But what it is a method for aborting large children. And in Canada, by the way, get this, there's no law against abortion. None. Zero. Nada. If you want to abort your baby in Canada, you can do it right up to 1 second before the moment of natural birth. You can get the child out of there and basically kill it, or kill it before you pull it out. But we also have laws against murder. And it so happens that large babies are hard to extract from an unripe womb. So an unripe womb, if you really pull on it, you may get 2 or 3 centimeters dilation or 4 centimeters dilation instead of, say, 10 or more, which you find in a natural childbirth. And so what the abortionist does is he manipulates the child in the woman's belly until the feet are facing the exit. And he reaches in and he pulls the feet out, pulls the baby out by the feet. So he's got the feet, he's got the legs, he's got the bum, he's got the back and the shoulders and the arms. The only thing he leaves still inside the mother's body, get it? It still falls under the criminal code law in Canada that it hasn't left the body of its mother intact and alive yet. He takes a special pair of scissors, whatever they're called, and he plunges them into the back of the skull of the child, and he puts a tube in there, a vacuum tube, and he sucks out the child's brains. And when he does that, the skull collapses, and it's much easier to pull out of the mother. And he's got his dead baby. He's not going to be charged with murder, and the mother has her abortion. I don't know. It seems to me if you wanted to describe hell on earth or a hellish regime, that would be it. And in my own book, The Trouble with Canada Still, which was a rewrite of the one you see behind my head there on the wall, which became a national bestseller. In the rewrite, I said that Canada has become an evil nation, an evil country. And I think any country that gets into this whole thing is an evil country, which is hiding from itself the fact that it is practicing a form of slavery and refuses to admit it or even to see it, actually see it. So,
William, today I came across some statistics, and I learned that so far in the last 50 years, the silent genocide of aborted babies is to the tune of 1.5 billion children.
It's terrible. It's terrible. And then, in my own book, The War Against the Family, and I didn't go into that in this show with you because it almost makes me weep. It's hard for me to talk about this for an hour and to draw out some of the examples from that chapter. But I encourage any of your listeners, get a hold of The War Against the Family, read that chapter. I call it the Invisible Holocaust. That's going to ring a bell with Jewish readers for sure. Yes. I call it the Invisible Holocaust. It's happening all over the world. China's famous for it. But to see the actual democracies of the Western world engaging in this to such an extent, I mean, numbers don't really matter. One baby's bad enough, but 100,000 in Canada, 1 million every year in the USA. And by the way, President Trump, when he got rid of the Roe versus Wade case, which legitimized the, I'm going to say, not abortion, because abortion was already legitimized there depending on the state that you lived in. And I don't know which states did and which states didn't. But suppose you live in Alabama where abortion was illegal, and another one lived in New York where it was legal. You had this patchwork quilt of states, some which allowed it and some which didn't. But the case called Roe versus Wade is where the Supreme Court of the United States of America decided to read into its own constitution based on a notion, I think, of what they call security of the person or privacy or some other bogus label that they used to insert an unmentioned, a completely unmentioned human right into the American Constitution, where abortion is never mentioned. But it included that right in the Constitution as if it had been written there by the founders, which would have outraged them, of course. For 50 years, 1 million American children were nuked this way. So you're talking 50 million that we actually know about. There's probably lots of them that we don't know about that are done privately or in secret. So it's a terrible business. And I think everybody should hang their heads in shame over this. And whether or not it's ever going to change, if there's ever going to be a new Wilberforce to make this change in the consciousness of the West, I don't know. Maybe it will be changed by circumstance. Let me just say, an important American author in the 1990s named Ben Wattenberg wrote a book called The Birth Dearth. And what he was talking about was the falling fertility rates in the Western nations. They're all failing as far as I can tell. There may be some that are still producing their own children, not counting immigration, but producing their own children at a natural replacement rate, which must be 2.1 children per woman. That's how it averages out statistically. So I think maybe Poland is there, maybe Ireland, but all the other Western democracies or something very close to that number, are not replacing their own populations through natural childbirth. So what they're relying on is immigration. Now, immigration is a very interesting topic to me, and I've written extensively about it in the Trouble with Canada book, as I say behind me. I did a whole chapter on immigration and all that. Because, nobody's actually against some immigration, but two things really bothered me about immigration in Canada. One of them was that nobody ever asked us. Pardon? I said, well, Canada is supposed to be a representative democracy. It's actually a constitutional monarchy, but with a strong democratic element in our parliament. But nobody ever asked the Canadian people, how much immigration do you want? And what kind of immigration? Now, before the 1960s, immigration in Canada, most immigrants would have looked like me. And even saying that today, people will say, that's a racist thing to say. I say, well, you call it what you want. But it's true, most of them would look like me. They mostly be white, Caucasian, whatever. And they come from a whole bunch of different European nations or South American nations or whatever, for the most part. Sure, there were some Orientals. Sure, there were some whatever in the mix. Canada always did that. But it tended to focus on immigrants who they thought would fit in well to a country of people who looked like them. And all they had to do was be willing to learn the language. But they usually came from Christian nations. So they had the God thing down pat. They had the race thing down pat. They just had to get the language thing going. And often they had other sorts of Western values shared by Canadians. But then it slowly began to change because of the influx of egalitarian politicians or very left-leaning politicians like Pierre Trudeau, who was our prime minister before a couple of times ago, I guess in the 60s. And he had 2 terms anyway, and he was prime minister for about 14 years, split up between 2 terms. But he famously said, it doesn't matter where the immigrants come from. When I heard that, I was shocked, especially because I had already written my 2 chapters in that book, one on immigration and one on foreign aid. In the foreign aid chapter, what I found out through pretty good research was that most of the countries to which Canada was giving foreign aid were themselves spending anywhere from 10 to 1,000 times the amount that we were giving them on bombs and airplanes, like military expenditures. And of course, I made myself unpopular saying, what are we doing giving foreign aid to a country like Zambia for whatever? I'm picking a country here because they're just turning around and spending all that money on bombs and airplanes. Why don't they just sell one of their own airplanes if they want to feed their poor? Why do we have to do it? That kind of thing. Anyway, you can make yourself very unpopular with these kinds of arguments, but I didn't mind. Being a writer is part of it's having a thick skin and being able to defend yourself in debate too. And I'm happy to say that for the most part, I can't remember ever losing an important debate on any of the things I write about, and that's because I'm not going to debate them unless I think I can beat the opponent with the points that I've researched and written about. At any rate, immigration is an answer to falling population. How serious is that? Well, when you depart from bringing in immigrants who are more or less like you, who share your religious beliefs, share your cultural values, are willing to learn your language, share all kinds of things that have to do with Western life, you're probably fortifying what I call the deep culture of the country. I distinguish deep culture from what I call skin deep culture. Skin deep culture is French restaurants, Italian clothing and cars, German cars for sure. I've got one, that kind of thing. Skin deep culture is all about, it's enjoyable. We like all that stuff. But deep culture is very different. Deep culture is about the compatibility of the people you bring in with your own civilization, your founding civilization. And Canada, for example, like many other Western nations, has always been multi-ethnic in many respects, but it's never before been multicultural. What does the label multicultural mean? Well, it's been imposed on a lot of Western nations by our leaders, by people like Trudeau Sr. and his son. Trudeau Sr., when he said it doesn't matter where the immigrants come from, he was talking about multiculturalism before the term became popular. And his own son, get this, has gone public with the stupid phrase that Canada is the world's first post-national state. Ooh, post-national state. I mean, the Treaty of Westphalia was when? I mean, I don't know, it was 1486 or something like that. I have to pick the date because I can't remember. It was a long time ago. After the Wars of Religion, the Treaty of Westphalia basically created the notion of the nation state. The nation state should have similar kinds of people. It should have fixed borders, common culture, common religion, all that kind of stuff. And if you go to another state, okay, you do in Rome. When you go to Rome, you do as the Romans do. Don't expect to impose your values, your national values on the other guy just because you're visiting. Be gracious, accept their values and their food and their culture and their religion. Okay, don't try to demystify it or denationalize it. Well, the Treaty of Westphalia basically created the nation states of the Western world, if not of the whole world. And there's a movement now internationally. Young Justin Trudeau, our Prime Minister, who's a very good-looking, interesting man, who I'm afraid to say is a bit of a fool, certainly in this respect, if not in many others, declared us to be the world's first post-national state. That was a direct verbal attack, which went viral on the media and in newspapers, to announce the end of the nation state. Really? Do we really think the nation state is going to be ended? Well, when you look at the World Economic Forum and you look at all these wealthy people getting together at Davos and places like that to try to dictate international world economic policy, there is something to what he said. At least the threat is certainly there. I don't think we're anywhere close yet, but Canada as a nation has been a dying nation for 35 or 40 years, by which I mean we've not been replacing ourselves. Who have we been bringing in, and what have we been relying on to grow our population? Because we have been growing. Canada is now around, 36 million. Not long ago, it was 32 million or whatever. So it's climbing all the time. It's by immigration. And for the most part, we're not bringing in people who look like me. In fact, British immigrants seem to have a hard time getting in, harder than, say, someone from Trinidad or someone from Colombia or whatever, for whom the doors seem to be open. In America, we have a horrendous example of immigrants streaming across the southern border of America with no control whatsoever. To me, if you don't have a border that you can control, you don't have a nation. I mean, that's the first thing I would say. If your border is wide open to anybody who wants to walk in, and if you've already said they can have all the benefits of the nation state without ever becoming a citizen, right off the bat, dental care, medical care, social care, income handed to them. I mean, it's unbelievable. That's happening in my country. My wife was asked to help with an immigrant group that brought in some immigrants from Iraq or whatever, poor things. They had 8 kids, and there wasn't a lot of education in that family. But she told me, not printable, you weren't allowed to say this in public, that family was going to pick up, I think, $60,000 tax-free in their first year, plus chauffeurs to drive them around, provided by, I don't know who, somebody's paying them. So the kind of the red carpet is being laid out to pop our population, but not necessarily with people who are like us. And I think it's dangerous. And when I say so, they call me a racist, but I don't think it's racist. It's actually for the love of my nation. I want to preserve the nation that I have. And I think if you're going to change the nation that we have had, you should ask the people. Otherwise, why are you calling yourself a damn democracy? The people should be asked, do you want to change the nature of this country? Do you want to change the ethnic balance of your country so that you become a minority in X number of years? What, 50 years, 40 years? I don't know. Do you want to become a minority in your own country or not? I think the people should be asked about the choices available to them, but instead it's been engineered from the top by elitist politicians like Trudeau and his son Justin Trudeau, who are running around saying there are no borders, there's no nation state. We welcome people from all over the world. 20 years ago, Canada's own Department of Statistics told us that we had 6 or maybe a dozen what they call ethnic enclaves. Get the phrase, ethnic enclaves. These are places in Canada where immigrants band together for what? To be with each other, to speak their own language from back home, to cook their own foods from back home. All these things that I felt they should always be able to do, but privately, not change the whole country to the way they think it ought to be. Well, now, today, I don't know, 8 years ago, I looked again, and the same Statistics Canada said we now have 265 ethnic enclaves. Now, these are not no-go zones yet, but they are ethnic enclaves where, for example, Muslims have created a whole community just south of me. It's got a lovely name. It's called Peace Village. If you go there, all the homeowners are Muslims. They have their Muslim temples and their whatever, and their rules of conduct, which I have to admire in many respects. At least they do have rules, what they ask people to stick to. Whereas, the Western democracies that I grew up with seem to almost have no rules now. We've become a rule-less entity. But anyway, this is what's happening, and we're keeping our population up with immigration. And I don't know why it's not a zero-sum game, because when immigrants come here from some other country, the other country's losing people that we're gaining. So they go down, we go up, or are they just breeding so fast that there's an endless supply of new immigrants to our country that are not necessarily like us, not necessarily interested in the Christian religion or the Judeo-Christian legal system on which Canada was built. There's no way of finding these things out. And having said that, I admire an awful lot of immigrants who come here because they are socially observant people. They do have religion. They understand the meaning of the law. And they're not into left liberal values. And so what do we have in Canada? We have politicians running around, I know some of them personally, trying to attract the votes of the immigrant community to their party on those grounds, conservative grounds. People who discipline their children, people who do not allow their children to swear in public, like we do. Not me personally, but Anglos that I see around at hockey games, soccer games, football games, whatever. The kids are running around using foul language and nobody's speaking to them. I don't want to get punched out by somebody, but often I'll speak to them. Hey, behave yourself, kid. You're going to talk that way, like go somewhere else. That kind of thing. Anyway,
William,
yep.
I would like just to say a few things, if I may. First thing about Israel, which is a very interesting anomaly. The birth rate is about 2.9, even 3 for Jewish families. And interestingly enough, because we are surrounded by very friendly, loving, and peaceful countries like Syria, Egypt, Jordan, we have to actually maintain our borders. So we are not under attack like in the West, and we are able to preserve and keep our identity to a certain degree. So the influences of this progressive agenda is not as intrusive like you would find it in Canada.
Well, that's interesting. I think what you're describing is probably natural to a country that's, first of all, it's fairly newly formed, and it's been under threat for a long, long time. And I think countries that are under direct threat do band together, and they focus on things like procreation and maybe family policy that helps the childbirth rate go up. But, Canada's rate is at 1.4. Has been for about 25 years. When I go to Toronto, I find I don't know where the hell I am. I got on a subway train down there. I don't know where I am. Don't know what country I'm in. You can't tell by looking around. Certainly ethnicity is no clue anymore in my country.
Yes. Another thing that I would like to emphasize is that I think the kind of culture which is completely bankrupt, morally bankrupt, and allows and promote the murder of babies, is a culture of death. And I don't think that such a culture can sustain itself for a long time. And if it's possible for people to actually accept the idea that killing babies is absolutely a matter of choice and it's okay, then eventually it will lead to the possibility of hurting and killing and controlling every other person in that culture.
I agree with you. It is already. Canada has a notorious act of euthanasia. It's called MAID, M-A-I-D, which stands for, get this, another euphemism, medical assistance in dying. That's what Canadians call it. And it came into force about 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, when, a few hundred people applied for MAID. Now there are thousands applying for MAID, and the government's even talking about, well, people who are simply unhappy or say they're unhappy or just don't want to live anymore, they can apply for MAID. And one of the first things that may happen to you, I'm not saying it's frequent yet, but I think it's going to be, like you say, if you go to a hospital and you're suffering from something, some kind of painful disease, which they haven't been able to fix yet, one of the doctors may walk up to you, and you do have the option of MAID, meaning if you want to get out of here because you can't stand the pain anymore, we can kill you legally. So that's happening in Canada. Of course, it's been happening in Oregon, California, and most notoriously in Holland for about 40 years. Holland actually has a death squad. They have euthanasia squads. By the way, abortion is described by many people as simply pediatric euthanasia. It's the same principle applied to unborn children as you apply to adults. And Holland got into this about 45 years ago. And there's a report your listeners may want to look for called the Remelink Report, R-E-M-M-E-L-I-N-K, Remelink. One thing I do admire about the Dutch is they walk around killing people quite easily, it seems, and they don't mind talking about it or admitting it or publishing reports on their own activities, which they hand around to journalists, and they say, this is what happened last year. In that report, and I'm not quoting, I'm just paraphrasing, you will find almost every year, and this does bother them a little bit, about 1,000 cases of older people, primarily in old age homes, who were put down without their knowledge or consent because they have no family, they're unable to give consent, and the government simply decides, the doctor decides, or some committee decides, that they have, here's the phrase, they have lives not worth living. Now, that came from a German phrase used by the Nazis in the Second World War called Lebensunwertes Lebens, which means life that's not worth living. And this is the phrase that the Germans used before they liquidated millions of people, disabled children to start with. All kinds of German kids were in care facilities because they were spastic or they were disabled, couldn't do whatever, and they needed being looked after by the state. The German authorities, once Hitler got going on this, I'll tell you how he did it. They would simply put them down by overdosing them with certain of their substances. I forget what they were. But if you want to get this story, there's a terrible book. I mean, it's a very good book, but it's a terrible experience. It's called The Nazi Doctors, and it's by Robert J. Lifton. I'm really pleased that at 82, I still have a bit of a memory. It's called The Nazi Doctors by Robert J. Lifton, and it's an analysis of how very highly educated, very professional medical people in Germany, as the Nazi train got rolling, got talked themselves into taking part in all this. And there's some incredible scenes in the book, which are right from documents, where Hitler is sitting at the chair. He's chairing this meeting at a table in some German medical facility where they're trying to deal with the problem of disabled children because they're costing the state a lot of money. And there's some fellow who speaks up, and again, I'm not quoting, but I think I'm pretty close, who basically says, we need bullets. We need bullets in the army, and we need boots. And the money that's going to keep these children alive could be used for that. It was considered a very powerful argument around the table where medical doctors in the military were making arguments for the killing, euthanasia of disabled children. So what they would do is they would give them an overdose of whatever it was over a period of a few weeks. The child would die of suffocation because it would destroy their breathing mechanism. And then the facility would send a heartfelt letter to the parents. Dear so-and-so, we are sorry to report that your little boy Anton died last week of suffocation because his lungs failed and all that kind of thing. And the parents would think that's just terrible, and they would cry, send for the body, bury the boy, whatever. But in the Nazi doctors, you will see the psychology of practicality, bumping the, I'm not saying they weren't moral people when they started, but they became simply practical people by the time they ended this process. They substituted practicality for morality. We need bullets, or we're going to be beaten. Germany will be crushed unless we have bullets and boots on the ground. We can't keep spending our money this way. You see, that's how it all changed. It's an incredible insight into, I'm not going to say how Germans behaved, but how human beings behave. They just happen to be German in that instance. I think almost all human beings who found themselves in that precise and exact situation may have behaved the same way, which is a terrible thing to believe, but I think it's true. And I think it's false to look back at human history and pretend that we would have done anything otherwise. For example, in Canada, we have this thing with the Japanese, where when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and all the rest of that stuff, and America went to war with Japan, and Canada got involved, we basically took the Japanese out of their homes and we put them in camps. They were called internment camps. And they weren't so bad. I mean, they were almost like concentration camps, except they weren't. They had beds, they had food, they had recreation spaces, but they weren't allowed to wander freely in Canadian society and make what the Canadian authorities felt was possibly trouble for Canada. In fact, at one time, a German submarine approached Vancouver Harbor on the west coast and tried to bomb one of our most famous lighthouses called the Estevan Lighthouse, because they didn't want it to guide ships. And they figured if they could destroy the lighthouse, ships would hit the rocks and the shore and they would founder. And the Japanese at the time even had a crazy scheme where they had these dirigible, this is all on the record, by the way, they had these dirigible balloons, which were quite sizable, and they put explosives on them, and they sent them up into the jet stream. They had them figured out so they would go as high as the jet stream, and that goes west to east, and it would blow them over Canada. And when they got over Canada, they would start losing altitude, and the explosive packages would explode and, kill Canadians. So when the Canadians learned this, and by the way, it didn't work very well. Most of them fell in the ocean, but some of them did explode, and a few Canadians did die because of it. But Canadians at the time felt were very justified in picking up the Japanese and interning them in camps. As nice and as pro-Canadian as they might seem, we have no way of telling. Any one of them could be a spy. And so when I say this to people, they say, oh, come on, you saying we would do it again? I'm not saying absolutely we would do it again, but I'm saying stop thinking that you are superior to the people who had to make the judgment in that day. That's historicism. It's you imposing current historical values on the historical past and reading the present into the past as if that's what the past was like. Well, it wasn't. I do think we would do it again if it happened exactly the same way again. So, and that's because no one is infallible. No one is above the possibility of human evil. In fact, it's a reality which is always lurking, which is why we need strong societies and strong religions and strong cultures. And I think you've had enough of me today.
No.
Thank you for listening.
It's an amazing presentation. I would just like to say that what you mentioned about Germany was completely legal, And about concentration camps, the first one in the 20th century was actually the British doing that to the white Africanos in South Africa. That was the first time that we enjoyed that. I don't know if you would be okay and ready to do that, but maybe, just maybe, for the sake of creating like a clip or a promo of maybe 30 seconds or 1 minute, maybe you can like give us a very strong warning into the future as a scholar, as a father, as a grandfather, and tell us something like in a clip, because everyone now consume knowledge through clips of 30 seconds. That's the capacity. Maybe you can say something very strong, intense, and emotional about abortion as a warning to the future. And if you're not ready to do it, then maybe some other time or whatever you feel like.
You mean get someone to film me warning?
Even now, if you can, if you're not ready, then it's absolutely okay. But if you're able to do it right now, then we will take it from the video and we will create a clip and we will use it as a warning for the future.
And this is basically on the topic of abortion.
Yes, sir.
Well, let's try. If we don't like it, we won't use it.
Okay.
So let me say that I had lunch with a very important political thinker about 30 years ago named David Frum. He's now the editor of an important American magazine called The Atlantic Monthly. And at that lunch, he asked me, what's the key issue that you think in the future of the Western democracies? And I said, it's abortion. It's a watershed issue. And he looked at me quite surprised. Why do you say abortion? And I said, because it's actually a form of human slavery, which we don't recognize as such yet. And it's being practiced by almost every democracy in the world. So these democracies have become slave regimes of a new kind, where perfectly healthy human beings are being deprived of their humanity in the name of egalitarian liberty. And I think it's just terrible and should be resisted. It should be turned around. How that's going to happen, I don't know. Are we ever going to find our Wilberforce, who was instrumental in the ending of chattel slavery, to end this, what I call the invisible Holocaust of abortion slavery? I don't know. I don't see anybody on the horizon. I do see people like myself making the arguments you're hearing. But I think the dehumanization of the West can be summed up in the story of the invisible Holocaust of modern abortion regimes.
Thank you very much.
That's it.
Yes. It was an amazing presentation, as usual. It's very informative, and I'm always very thankful for your time and your patience and your knowledge and your care.
Well, thank you. I do care, and thank you so much for caring. I enjoy being with you. And my wife accuses me of being a little bit egotistical because I like to talk about these things, but it's actually refreshing for me because I'm not going to say I've been ignored. I haven't. Many of my books have been bestsellers, and I've been interviewed hundreds and hundreds of times, mostly positively, often negatively, by people who found my arguments offensive or disturbing. But I can't say I never got airtime, but I can say that I'm going to call it a tsunami, a cultural tsunami of leftism has been washing over us ever since I've been writing books. And I don't think my books have gotten us very far in terms of overturning that, but I do think they've been helpful in terms of slowing it down, at least. And maybe that's true of these interviews as well, which is why I enjoy doing them. So thank you again for having me, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Yes, sir. And you're always welcome to come back. So I'll see you in 2 weeks. Have a beautiful day.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.